Okay. So good evening and welcome at the Royal Netherlands Institute in Rome. I'm Maria Bonaria Urban. I'm the Director of Study in History, and it's a great pleasure to welcome you on behalf of the academic staff of the KNIR. And a cordial welcome, of course, also to those who are joining us remotely. As you probably know, our KNIR Research Dialogue series focuses on the topic of colonialism from an interdisciplinary and transtemporal perspective. And this event is the second, I think, of this academic year. And our guest today is the historian, Dr. Roberta Biasillo from Utrecht University. So first of all, I would like to thank Roberta for kindly accepting our invitation. And it's a great pleasure to learn more about your research and your recent publication on this topic. In fact, today, Roberta will talk on our research into fascist colonial rhetoric and practices in North and East Africa between 1922 and 1943 from the perspective of environmental history. So something new for this lecture series. Only a few words about the schedule of today. As usual, we will start with a lecture, which will last 45 minutes, and then we will have plenty of time for discussion. And also those who are online can join us in the discussion, and they can pose questions in the chat or use the function raise hand, and they can ask their questions. Before handing over to Roberta, I would like to briefly introduce her. Roberta Biasillo is assistant professor in contemporary political history at Utrecht University. She earned a PhD in modern European history at University of Bari. She has been a postdoctoral researcher at the KNIR Royal Institute of Technology in Stockholm, the Rachel Carson Center for Environment and Society in Munich, and the European University Institute in Florence. Her research interests lie at the confluence of environmental history and political history. She has focused on marginal environments embedded in Italian 19th century liberalism and on the role of African colonial environments in shaping Italian fascism. She has finalized a forthcoming monograph in Italian reconstructing the history of the Pontine Marshes from the 1870s to the 1920s from an environmental microhistory perspective. And her co-authored volume, Mussolini's Nature, an environmental history of fascism, has been recently published by the MIT Press. Her research project on the global environmental history of modern Libya has been granted by the NWO, so NWO, Dutch Research Council. And the title of our presentation is The Ecologies of Italian Colonialism, Fascist Enterprises in North and East Africa. So please, Roberta, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for being here. And I want to start this talk by thanking you, Maria, for welcoming me. And I want to thank the Institute for inviting and hosting me today. It is my pleasure to share my research. That is a research that I shared with colleagues Mark Armiero and Wilco Graf von Anderberg. My contribution to this novel approach to the study of Italian fascism is part of a larger project, as Maria just said, about the global history of Libya between mid-18th century to the 1970s. And in the trajectory of modern Libya, Italians and the Italian state play several crucial roles. The goal of this talk is twofold. On one hand, I will try to offer an overview of how fascist policies and practices materially altered colonial environments in East and North Africa. On the other hand, I will explain how specific understanding of colonial environments informed policies and mirrored the transformation of the regime itself. So this twofold interpretation of the relationship between nature and politics debunks the myth of a green fascism that is pretty much connected to the idea of the policies of reforestation, autarky, and attention to limit consumption, and also to nature conservation and the establishment of national parks. Then there is also the myth of fascist agricultural valorization of the desert. So, and okay, this is connected to the building of infrastructure in East Africa or the agricultural schemes in African colonies. And also the idea of an Italian empire as the empire of work and workers. And then we have to think about whose work is embedded in the construction of the empire. I will focus on the fascist side of this story, with the awareness that many other sides can be explored when reconstructing the history of colonial Libya. And there are Libyan historians and Libyan novelists that have written about what happened in Libya during the Italian colonization. And I also want to stress the role of different primary sources, so novels and poems, if we want to look at the colonial history from other perspectives. So I will look at Italian sources today, but I'm pretty much aware that there are many other sites that, even if they're not part of this talk, they are part of the history of colonial Libya. And the point I will try to make today is that even exploring sources produced by convinced fascists and colonial authorities, the history of Italian colonization is not the history of farmers and builders. It's not the history of agricultural valorization and civilization. And those narratives are myths, and nature is a powerful ground to debunk the myths if we today still need to debunk those myths. In order to respond to the goal of aligning nature and politics, this talk zooms into the period of 1922-1943. That is the period of the fascist regime in Italy. But of course, environmental periodization do not follow this institutional periodization. And this is only one way in which we can divide the fascist period and the fascist colonization of Africa. Because continuities and ruptures occurred within the fascist era, and they cut across the liberal and republican eras. And this talk will focus on the ruptures that we can find within the period of the fascist regime. Apart from a few articles, the environmental dimension of fascist colonial enterprise is really a realm that wanting scholarship at the moment. And the research I'm going to introduce today is just the beginning of a much larger potential set of research projects. And I hope to convince you that the environmental perspective matters if we want to investigate, especially the colonial environment and the fascist colonial environment. So I will present two stories from Northern East Africa about the entanglements of nature and politics based on a combination of different types of sources: propaganda sources, archival and administrative sources, and technical and scientific reports. So the combination and the inner dialogue among these three types of evidence has been crucial to highlight unexplained decisional turning points concerning colonial policies. And I think that the foundation of any historical work is empirical evidence. And in this talk, I will discuss two stories in details, paying attention to the use of primary sources. And after the two stories, I will conclude with some historiographical reflections, and then I will look forward to your questions and comments. The first story is, I titled the first story, The Rest of Nothing. This picture is from 1924. In 1924, the Italian Army Corps of Engineers in Cyrenaica described Libya as a lonely plateau dominated by the wind, where one had to live for months in tents, with rationed and not always clean water. Other sources spoke of a land covered by sand dunes, low spots filled with salty water, and pre-desert and desert areas, with the exception of a few oases. In short, Libya was nothing but a desert in the fascist understanding of desert ecosystems. And Turks, Arabs, and Bedouins, always according to the fascist sources, had all declined to battle with Libyan desert. Libya was an utterly hostile territory where the term reclamation was even hard to be pronounced, a word that no one until then had even imagined. So the fascist regime was the first regime that tried to reclaim Libya. And this is true also if you look at different reports proposed by British scientists or even Italian scientists from the liberal period. So Libya, during the fascism, conceived as a modern, profitable colony, had to be entirely created. So this is the idea of desert as nothing that had to be created, thus requiring an agrarian reclamation effort so powerful that it would make even countries with long colonial traditions feel faint of heart. And Libya became a model across European countries and across colonial powers of tropical agriculture in the 1930s. Italy had obtained a difficult habitat that, according to governor of Tripolitania, Emilio de Bono, was suitable only for a handful of people who were ready to take on any kind of sacrifice and face, and I'm quoting here, face a series of disenchantments and disillusions without losing faith and perseverance. So who were these individuals that were suitable for this environment? At the end of the 1920s, journalist Angelo Piccioli described the temperament, experience, and agricultural holdings of these pioneers, of Italian pioneers that moved to Libya in the 20s. And there are a series of articles published in the popular magazine, L'Italia Coloniale, that was an illustrated magazine, so it had a lot of circulation among the Italian public opinion. One of the settlers celebrated by Piccioli was Pasquale Seccia Cortes, who in 1926 had obtained in Zawiya, Tripolitania, 2 lots of 110 and 180 hectares. Seccia Cortes was the former general administrator of Roman Prince Fabrizio Colonna and the sworn enemy of those peasants who claimed land from large absentee landlords in the early post-war period. So think about all the rhetoric that we know about the colonization of Libya, and this is exactly the opposite of what we expect. So Piccioli described Seccia Cortes as a solitary, austere man, opposed to any superfluous expenditure, intolerant to ordinary life, rough, bronze, lion-like, not only man of action, but a man of principle, technically and politically suited to the imperial destiny that awaited him. So he personified the perfect fascist man. The transformation of his portion of steppe resembled the Christian Genesis. In 6 days, he tamed indigenous workers and nature. Within a year, Seccia Cortes had planted 20,000 grape vines, 8,000 grafted olive trees, 3,000 seedlings olive trees. I mean, the attention to figures is an important element to make this propaganda description even more real. And 2,700 almond trees, 150 general fruit trees, 100 eucalyptus trees. He also had a nursery and produced forage. Another model pioneer was Sicilian Prince Ugo Moncalda di Paternò, who moved to Africa with the desire to cooperate in the reconstruction, and I'm quoting from this article, to cooperate in the reconstruction of a world, or rather the creation of a world. So the desert was nothing and the desert had to be created. So the idea was that the creation of Libya as an agricultural colony was a creatio ex nihilo. And this is a sentence that records in a lot of propaganda sources. A different type of pioneer was scientist Battaglia. He worked as chemist at the Polytechnic of Milan and in one of the most famous chemical industry of the country, the Montecatini. He obtained, in 1924, he decided to devote his life to agriculture, and he obtained a 700-hectare farm in Tripolitania and transformed it in a modern farm. Piccioli wrote, he moved so much land that the builders of the ancient pyramids of Egypt paled in comparison. Last figure that I would like to keep this person in mind is another aristocrat, Marquis Gravina. Again, he is introduced as an example of the race of, the race of rulers that the new imperial Italy had to form. So the concession of this nobleman from Catania extended for more than 1,000 hectares and constituted an incomparable spectacle of moral beauty in the much maligned Tripolitanian area. In 3 years, Gravina had planted 150,000 trees, almond, olive, peach, carob, and fruit trees in general. He had built 5 farmhouses, dug 14 wells, and he has placed 48 Italians and two Tunisian families on his farm. In a few years, El Grueb, the name of his farm, became a destination of colonial pilgrimage. But if we read these propaganda sources, one question one question raises, but if this private model of colonization was so successful, why did the regime abandon it in the early 1930s? And it is hard to follow the development of these very concessions. However, we are quite lucky. However, we are quite lucky because the archival collections of the Italian Institute for Social Security that played a crucial role in the demographic colonization of Libya and in the agricultural valorization of Libya offer some hints and allows us to follow the development of those very farms and also of other farms. So its collection starts where our journalist ends his journey. And in this collection, we encountered Alessandro Chiavolini. Alessandro Chiavolini went to Libya in 1934. He never went there before. So he spent several years as Mussolini's side and in crucial position within fascist institutions. In 1926, he was one of the lucky concessionaires that we have mentioned before of Libyan territories. There were two major decrees of expropriation of Libyan territories in the 1920s. So Italy decreed a lot of Libyan territory as state domain, and this state domain could be handed over to concessionaires almost for nothing. So they just received large plots of land in Libya. So Chiavolini had obtained a land concession of 1,356 hectares. Think that farmers' concessions were 30, 40 hectares. So those initial farms were huge. And Chiavolini moved to Libya in 1934 with just one goal, the goal of getting rid of his concession. Chiavolini had three important factors on his side: the favor of Italo Balbo, the newly appointed governor of Libya, the need for land by the National Fascist Institute for Social Security, which in those years had joined the Agency for the Colonization of Libya to support the project of agrarian colonization, and third, a new direction of the regime in favor of colonial enterprises conducted directly by the state. Long story short, Chiavolini succeeded in getting rid of the concession in 1938. In 1940, obtained over 15 million lire, a sum hardly imaginable a few years earlier for a piece of land he had gotten almost for free. Chiavolini was not the only private concessionaire that sold at incredibly high prices their concessions to the state or to para-state institutions. Indeed, the size of the sale became such that colonial authorities had to try to put a halt to those property transfers. Interestingly, Marquis Gravina in 1938 contacted the Institute for Social Security to sell his own farm. Not only his farm was described at the end of the 1930s as a barren steppe, but the state also absorbed the debts accumulated during its management. On the ashes of such a failure, and on a land that was unsuitable for European modeled agriculture, the state launched its most propagandized demographic agrarian model of colonization of Libya. To cover and enable ongoing, as well as future speculation, the approvals of the governors and the business intrigue of fascist regime were not enough. A new vision was required, a narrative that would produce a different environment. A colonial nature in light with new policies of fascism, colonial, migration, demographical, all those policies clashed in a new construction of Libyan environment. And also the idea of building consensus was extremely important in allowing Italian families that were considered unemployed in Italy to move to Libya. So in the context of fascism of the 1930s, Libya became the promised land for the masses. And this is the beginning of the second story. To reinvent the role of African colony, the fascist regime had to engage in a vast campaign of persuasion in order to build and spread a universally positive opinion of populating the colonies. Apart from Antarctica, Italians spread over all the continents, but they never considered Libya a preferred destination. They went to North Africa, but they went to Tunisia, to Morocco, but very few Italians moved to Libya. Moreover, Italy counted a vocal and authoritative anti-colonial public opinion. think about the powerful image of Libya as a sandbox that fascism exploited in this first idea of colonization for pioneers. So indeed, the new colonial policies proceeded hand in hand with the build of a more centralized regime, the building of the consensus, but also the creation of a different Libyan environment. So the first step was putting to an end of the image of Africa as a mysterious place. In 1928, the first Atlante delle Colonie Italiane was printed with the support of the ministries of the colonies. The second step was the assimilation of Libyan environments to Italian ones. The director of the monthly magazine, Nazione d'Impero, pointed out that in some respects, the imperial space was even better than the traditional Italian space, because the role of tradition and the role of hierarchies was not present. So the environment of the colony, from a historical and legal point of view, did not bear any sign of the past. And this is a myth of settler colonies and settler colonial communities. And yeah, the physical space was created as the combination of, as the place to combine the impulse of the colonizer and the abundance of nature. So Libya was completely recreated around this idea of abundance. In 1938, the peak year of the demographic colonization project, with the landing to Libya of 20,000 settlers on October 28, the Cyrenaic Jebel, the Green Mountains of the Arab, resembled in fascist sources more and more the Green Umbria. So they built this comparison between Libya and Umbria. The relationship between the motherland and the lands of the empire was maintained through the name chosen for the new towns. East Africa white villages were named Romagna d'Ethiopia, Veneto d'Ethiopia, Puglia d'Ethiopia. Propagandistic sources expressed the transfiguration of the motherland in the colonies and vice versa. The settlers from Romagna saw everything through the eyes of the faith. In the heart of each of them, there was the distant land that descended in one piece, compact and orderly on African soil, with the name of its cities and towns painted clearly on the tractors, with its traditions and unmistakable dialect, with its sobriety and its strong-willed people. Forlì, Ravenna, Rimini, and Predappio were in the hearts of the settlers. The living miracle of a region that recreated the image of itself in a new land of conquest. The idea of miracles is very strong in Italian propaganda sources, so fascists itself use miracle a lot as a term. Apparently, other miracles took place over the late 1930s. First and foremost, the miracles of water, modern homes, and privately owned farms. The long-standing fear that underground water would be scarce seemed to be unfounded. Drilling in Tripolitania had revealed a considerable wealth of water at an average depth ranging between 15 to 18 meters. Again, there's a lot of attention to figures, but those figures are completely, are not confirmed by private firms that were asked to drill wells. Actually, they talk about 70, 80 meters of depth. It was said that near Benghazi in Cyrenaica, at a depth of only 12 meters, an aquifer so rich in water that a more powerful pump had to be installed in order to extract more than 600 cubic meters of water flowing daily. So Tripoli in the mid-1930s boasted the new aqueduct that supplied the city with fresh and plentiful water, endured by pumps that remained in operation for 20 hours a day. Modern mechanical means and electrification would allow the settlers of the new Italy to penetrate to greater depths. And a careful photographic campaign propagated the result of audacious drilling. And then on this picture from the 1910s, we see the traditional wells that were activated by animals or human force. And then we see how the fascist regime really exploited the underground water reserves of Libya. Then the other miracle is the miracle of modern homes. So the settlers would feel at home, even in the literal sense of the word. So the press reported on how the dwellings, homes were designed to respond to environmental conditions and were similar to houses built in Italy in seaside areas, or they resembled alpine resorts. Images of model villages, such as the village Michele Bianchi, run by the Institute for Social Security, with houses surrounded by 30 hectares of flat and fertile land close to the coast, seemed to be equipped with an electric pump that supplied water, and all these images were meant to encourage Italian families to move to North Africa. 63 families arrived in the village Michele Bianchi in 1936, and 75 were expected in 1938. They expected to find a farmhouse with 3 bedrooms, a large kitchen, a warehouse, a bread oven, a courtyard. If we leave the propaganda sources aside, on September 6, 1940, 4 settlers from the above-mentioned families filed a complaint. And filing a complaint during the high day of the fascist regime was not an easy operation to do, especially if you were a farmer. So they addressed the president of the National Institute for Social Security that was running the village. And they wrote, "We are colonists from the expedition of the 20,000 and have been in Libya for almost 2 years with the Fascist Institute for Social Security. Shortly after our arrival, the rains began, and we had the bitter surprise of seeing that a little or a lot of water entered all the rooms of our new houses. The ceilings were cracked, even though the houses had just been finished. We mentioned this to our superiors. They came to see and promised to have the ceilings repaired. They promised again and again, but the houses, not having yet been repaired, became even more cracked. And on Sunday, September the 1st, when the rain fell for a couple of hours, we got soaked, as did the beds, the grain in the storerooms, and the livestock in the stable. It is simply shameful that new houses are in such a miserable state in less than 2 years. In good fascist style, we must cut short the lengthy paperwork and take care of the problem immediately. It will not be necessary to write to the Duce to have our homes repaired. We know that in these moments he has much more to do and think about for the good of our homeland. There must be someone who has the specific duty to help us colonists. Come and visit our homes, and it will be painful for you to see that we have told you the truth." Of course, this follows the genre of the letter to the authority, but colonists Spain and their truth were not of interest of any authority. In reality, it was the Duce himself who had planned the arrival of this army of workers. Army because there is a military intention behind the demographic colonization of Libya. So he asked this event to be immortalized and celebrated with every means available. In 1938 and in 1939, the transfer of Italian families to the fourth shore, as Mussolini nicknamed Libya, happened at Mussolini's orders, despite the negative opinion of technicians and pleas of official sides to stop and postpone the send of new families. The land was not ready, and there was no water, despite the powerful technical means deployed. Companies asked to drill 70, 80 meters wells, even if they had everything to gain from a collaboration with the regime in terms of political favor and high profits, deserted the auctions, and, when explicitly invited, declined. Several agronomists from the Colonial Agricultural Institute in Florence ceased the collaboration with the regime. Others were forced to forge and edit ad hoc reports to align with the demographical and military plans of the regime. Animals and humans suffered the attack of parasites and lack of water and food. Where private individuals had failed, the state failed too. The world war in Libya made the condition of colonial families and local communities even more dramatic and exposed the economic and ecological artificial balance of the colonies. Lack of food and fodder, military occupation and anti-colonial resistance, blockage of transport and imports, and the lack of energy and fuel revealed how the noble epic described by fascist propaganda had turned out to be a bloody tragedy. There are more stories. So those two stories are samples of a paradigmatic approach to nature. And we have seen how colonial environments were constructions that generated and followed the regime's plan. The environment of Libya is not a static element, but it evolves along with the demographic, military, economic, administrative development of the regime. And this is the very essence of the idea of an environmental history. So a history that is able to establish connection with the natural world and other areas of like the social part or the economic aspect. So without going into details, it is worth mentioning another extremely relevant and extremely fascist too, conceptualization of nature, namely the autarkic nature. Since 1937, colonial ground represented the ideal space to create the narrative of East Africa as the land of gold. And of course, this was based on evidence of superficial gold, but really there were no scientific reports that supported the industrial level exploration of mineral resources. Actually, in this respect, geologists were extremely vocal, even on propaganda outlets, and they asked the regime not to pursue mineral explorations. When samples of gold for museum and exhibitions were needed, colonial authorities lied about their provenience, and gold was sent to Italy from British Sudan. The same politicized science, together with technical and financial limits, of course, of the regime, did not push for the exploitation of Libyan hydrocarbons. Although, as soon as Italians left North Africa, Standard Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, and British Petroleum started their surveys. Was autarky ever achieved in colonies? Well, no. Colonies, since the construction of Italy abroad, drained financial resources, food, animals, plants, everything was sent from Italy. The regime tried to cover this failure in different ways, such as the regime defined autarkies in different ways, according to the area and according to the years. So many other stories around the environment wait to be told, and they always follow this pattern. I will conclude now. So I want to go back to the adopted time frame of this research. So although it's debatable if the time period 1922-1943 represented a rupture in the environmental transformation of Italy, an exploration of the different role played by the environment within the fascist era allows finally for the inclusion of the 1920s into the description of the fascist period, because very little, if anything, has been written about the first 20 years of colonial initiatives, due to several reasons, of course. So the first reason is that there is an uneven production and uneven accessibility of sources. So it is not surprising that there's a boom of state-produced sources in the 1930s against historical research on the 1920s that should address private archives. So individuals, families, associations, or private firms. Then it's true that propaganda is effective, is sophisticated, sneaky, and conniving, and even nowadays can be so for historians. So if we think about the extremely detailed description that propaganda produced, so those descriptions had the powerful impact also on historiographical reconstruction. And then fascism produced its own teleological narrative of its colonial enterprise. And in this narrative, what happened in the 1920s was incorporated in this idea of colonial and demographic enterprise. So the 1920s are described as a preparatory period for what happened in the 1930s. And if we look at sources, we know that those two moments are not one in continuation with the others. Actually, the failure of one opened up for the conceptualization a completely different plan. So I think this inconsistency within fascist policies can be even more explored. So to tackle those three methodological flaws in Italian fascism research, an environmental history approach is particularly appropriate. So the analysis based on ecological failures and limits, and the idea of this interconnection between the environment and other levels of historical analysis are essential elements in the historiography of the environment. So the idea of failures and limits are present in the foundational text of the environmental historiography, which is The Dust Bowl by Donald Worster. Then, to unsettle historicism and progressive narrative, again, we can refer to another major contribution to colonial history based on the concept of disarray. So there's no order, there's no planning. Everything needs to be adjusted to the environment. And in this sense, the disarray is also the product of the role of the environment, not the agency, but at least the role of the environment. And non-European environments were always a discovery for European powers. And then the last category that I want to mention is, and the last text I want to mention is the book by John McNeill, Mosquito Empires, because in this book, we look at the environment in a non-deterministic way. So the environment can halt or can boost colonization. And in this way, I think the environment represents a historicizing category. So it's not a static environment, but plays with other levels of analysis. And I think I've done. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Roberta, for such inspiring and original, I would say, research. I'm sure there are many questions in the room and maybe also online. So now we can start the discussion. If someone, we can look at people, because otherwise we don't see the chat. Yes. Yeah. Otherwise I will start with some question from myself. Okay, maybe I can start with a first question. You used the concept of ecologies in the plural. Your research is about Libya, but also East Africa. So can you explain why you're using the plural in relation to these regions, or is the same process, or there are differences between the two countries or two regions, I have to say?
Yeah, no, this is something I also thought a lot, because at the beginning, this project was on Italian colonies in Africa in general. And then when I started approaching these two regions from like the environmental perspective, those two regions are completely different. So Libya is 95% a desert country, while East Africa it's a combination of different environments. So we have tropical environments with forested areas, we are urban areas. So the transformation is completely different. And also how and we see this in the rural environment, for example, with the establishment of villages. But of course, there are overlappings. So we have plantations in both areas, but the role of water, for example, is completely different, and also how the availability of water is different. The role of indigenous communities and how indigenous communities were included into the agricultural schemes of fascism is completely different. So in East Africa, indigenous workers were parts and parcel of the plantation schemes, for example, while in North Africa, only at the very end of the colonization phase, the regime started to create Muslim villages, as they called it, for indigenous families. But I mean, even those were a failure, because like Libyan communities did not want to move into the fascist and sedentary villages. So yeah, there are a lot of differences, and those differences are very much connected to the type of environment. If we look at of course, if we want to have that there's a common, if we look at the fascist development, yes, there is a common path, especially after the foundation of the empire. And those two areas, I mean, the idea of the role of the Opera Nazionale Combattenti is the same. So there are several overlappings, but from an environmental point of view, those are completely different. And then in Libya, there was no mineral exploration, while in East Africa, the idea of the mineral resources was very very much connected with the autarky plans. And then also, if we look at autarky, the idea was that East Africa could provide resources for Italian industries. And while autarky for Libya was more like Libya will become a self-sufficient area, and it will not need the import from the motherland. So, and then even connected to the autarky plans, they follow two completely different ideas of autarky, but also timing. The timing is very different. So in Libya, decolonization started in the 1920s, while in East Africa, when the fascist regime arrived, was with the proclamation of the empire. So those are quite different areas if we want to look at them.
So the plural is necessary, definitely. Other question, maybe? Yes, Tess.
Thank you very much. It's fascinating presentation. It's really very interesting to see from a classical archaeologist's point of view, because there are, I think, many echoes of, let's say, ancient models of colonization that take similar views on conquering nature as if there was nothing before. But of course, in this case, if you talk about creatio ex nihilo, there actually was something before. So I was wondering, because there are even, I think on the cover of the L'Italia Coloniale, there was also a classical arch depicted. So could you say something more about the use perhaps of these classical examples along the saying, siamo tornati? Do they play this out as well? Do you have any evidence for that?
Yeah, no, there's a very contradictory role of the past, and the relation with the past of the fascist regime is not simple to explain. So even in that sense, it was really inconsistent. So one of the idea of even in the term itself of reclamation, so you want to reclaim something that was there, but at the same time you want to create out of nothing. So there is this idea of completely transform something, but there are a lot of Roman echoes in the fascist propaganda. And another important common sentence is we need to resurrect the granary of Rome. And this was a common path both for all North African countries. So the same was for French colonies in Tunisia. Then the fascist regime played a lot with distance and assimilation. So the Roman past was a way to assimilate, but even for boosting tourism, for example, or creating a sort of destiny of the Italian, the creation of a new Italian empire. But there's not a clear approach to the use of Roman past. It's always mixed, and it depends on the policy that the regime wanted to implement. So I think that really the category of disarray applies to every aspect of the fascist regime. Even in the economic policies, there's not a clear direction. So, and there are inconsistent policies. So the idea of creating the new strapaese with the extreme modernization and heavy industries. So I don't think we need to look for consistency, but of course the Roman past is a powerful tool, especially for international, it was more used in the international arena more than in the national one. Okay.
Thank you.
I see a question in the chat. Quite difficult, I have to say. What is fascism?
What is fascism? Well, fascism shaped itself over the first 10 years of the regime. So I don't think we can have a single definition of fascism. We can look at the formation of fascism as a tendency to create a centralized administration. So And if we want to look at the role, I don't know if I can define fascism from the perspective of an environmental historian. And from that perspective, I think that we have, well, one first way to describe fascism is the arrays of different like projects on the environment. So if we look at the liberal environments were really like a hub of conflicts and different projects. During the first 10 years of the fascist regime, we see the disappearance of conflicts and also the creation of a single model to manage the environment. So this is one way to define fascism from an environmental perspective. Another way is also the missing understanding of what a complex ecosystem is, and the idea of mechanization and technologization of an environment, and the idea that technology could replace the complex network of among species. So this was very like peculiar of the fascist regime. If we look at how the technology replaced the complexity of the relation among species and among communities and nature. And maybe a third point that I think it's important, I mean, fascism means the complete and irreversible transformation of the environment. And the idea of transformation of communities and natural environment is typical of fascism, but it's completely absent in the liberal time and will be absent also in the Republican period. So if I have to define fascism from an environmental perspective, probably I will look at these three, elements.
Other question, maybe? Yes.
Yes, thanks, Roberta. This was tremendously interesting. I have two questions. I really liked your microhistorical approach, the word you used of stories, telling stories. So I wanted to ask, what is the microhistorical approach helping you to do? Why tell stories? Why is this important here? Mm-hmm. And the second question was, did they never think to ask the Libyans? I mean, I know this is probably a naive question, but did they never think in any way when they were thirsty, when they could not find water, when their plants were dying, did they never think, okay, there's this myth of the tabula rasa, but we're going to die of hunger if we don't actually ask the Libyans how they've managed to live very well here for hundreds of years?
Yes, they did. They did during the first 10 years. So the idea was to, this was very present during the liberal period. So until 1928, there was a cooperation among Italians and Libyans. And also Italians looked pretty much at how Libyans manage water. So they look at natural wells, or they look at how to store waters from erratic rivers. So there are a lot of studies on which plants are really suitable for that environment. So even when in fascist source, and the olive plant is a way to look at this combination among Libyan communities and Italian colonizers, because the olive plant, when Italians talk about olive trees, they are not Italian olive trees. They try to import plants from Italy, but they died. So they started to use Libyan plants with Italian branches. I don't know how you call this technique. So they try to combine these two different plants, and they had a lot of a mutual learning. But in the 1938, there was really a demonization of everything that was Libyan. So, and they had to cope with Libyans only when they had Libyan resistance attacks. But it's true that in 1931, Libyan resistance was almost crushed. So, and also Libyan resistance moved in other countries. So either they were killed or they moved away. But in the first years, you see a lot of cooperation. And also in East Africa, this is pretty much studied. You have mixed farms and also mixed plants. So they started introducing American cotton, and then they went back to use indigenous cotton, because even if it was less long, or I don't know, it was less thick, it survived in arid environments. So still it was profitable, while American cotton was not profitable. So yeah, there are a lot of connection, of course, to look. It's a bit hard to find them in sources, but in technical reports you can find them. Yeah. And which one was the first question? Okay, no, well, I don't know if we can do microhistory with fascism, but I think that single stories are, maybe not single stories. What I did here was really going depth into like sources, because there are a lot of sources that have been looked from an administrative perspective, but there are a lot of like details about the environmental failure that no one has really like searched for it. So I think probably if you want to look at the 1920s, probably a microhistory approach can be more interesting. When the state intervened, I think that the microhistory cannot be useful anymore because it's a national history. And to have a microhistory, you also need to look at people that are not relevant. And I don't think this is easy to do with fascism and nationalization projects of fascism. But before fascism, you can, I mean, microhistory is a very like interesting way to look at environmental transformations from below.
Other question, maybe in the room? Yes. Okay.
I wondered, do you also use, let's say, science-based environmental data to support your research, or is that of a time scale that it's not, that you can't use it for your more precise historical questions?
No, there are, like, during the liberal period, you have a lot of interesting scientific reports, especially on soil composition, of the presence of water. During the fascist regime, I mean, in the 20s, you still have a very active and vocal, like all the collections of the Colonial Agricultural Institute in Florence is, I mean, it's based on scientific data, and the first phase of reclamation, really, you have a lot of like interesting like use of eucalyptus, or how to remove indigenous plants, which plant can be introduced. During the fascist period, those from the mineral, like for the mineral stories, I think I found like scientists more genuine, and they were extremely critical, but it was really impossible to lie. So they did not find gold or mineral resources, and they imported them. So and even on propaganda outlets, you have like real scientific report. Sometimes scientific reports are also used to provide a lot of details and to let a reader lost. So you can't understand really the matter of the discussion, or what was the point that the author is making, because they are so complex that it's a way to not to say anything, to give a lot of details without saying really, to make a point against or in favor of the regime. So there's a very interesting use of scientific reports, and sometimes they are more interesting than others, or also when they lie. So you have the same scientist that in 1 week can change completely his opinion about the same plot of land because Mussolini intervened. So, and I think that what we call science is in the 20s is very different from what we call science in the 30s. Yeah. So science in the 30s is a pillar of the fascist regime, and is not autonomous science as we think it's science today. So, yeah.
But is it also in a way, would it be possible to use, like we archaeologists do, that we look for middens to look at pollen analysis, to analyze pollen, for instance, to see what actually happens? Because if the scientific reports of the time are very biased or lying or incomplete, you could imagine that if you reconstruct what actually happened in that time period. But
I think it hasn't been done for this. There are no data available, but this is a methodology that environmental historians generally, I mean, some environmental historians generally do, especially medieval environmental historians use a lot of scientific data, especially on disasters or ecological transformations. But I don't think there's anything on Italian colonialism.
It would be interesting to see if what actually happened and what
Yeah.
is been said that happened. Anyway, sorry.
Maybe something that you said before on the mineral resources in East Africa. Maybe could you elaborate a bit more how they constructed this idea of a golden land?
Yes, so there are two main reasons why they built East Africa as the land of gold. I mean, three. The first one is that there were already like mines, especially of platinum, that were present there, and they were small industrial enterprise for the extraction of platinum. So that was but again, it was not an Italian. It was only the name was Italian, but it was a French, Italo-German industry. Then the second thing is that indigenous communities used gold to trade. So there were some traces of gold, but they were superficial. So they used these small, like fragments of gold to exchange with other goods. So they built on this idea that there was gold, and even indigenous communities without any scientific means, they could like extract gold. So imagine the fascist regime with all the technology that it could deploy. And then the third one was the conceptualization of nature that is connected to autarky. So you need to imagine something that is not there, and you have to extract resources from the ground. And the ground, or like even like bodies of water, were an interesting site to develop this idea of autarky. So there's something that is not visible, but the regime will extract wealth from the ground. So they actually started with massive industrial, of course, they started with deforestation, with the destruction of the existing environments. They did excavations, and at the end, excavations required a lot of infrastructures, also water infrastructures, because you need water to do all industrial activities. And then at the end, it failed because they didn't find enough gold to justify the investment. But not only gold was extracted. So if you look at the scientific reports again, they extracted everything. I mean, even minerals that did not really have a value. So the destruction that they produced was much more than the wealth that they really digged out of the ground. So I think that's another thing to look at. And there are really no research on.
Yeah. And this brings me to the next question, because you are talking about what was destroyed by these enterprises. So when we talk about fascism now, we talk a lot about legacy. So when we talk about legacy of environmental history, so what is the result of all this enterprise for this country? So what we have left or what we have destroyed there?
I think I know the Libyan case a bit better. So if we look at the Libyan case, the Italian agricultural model of valorization remained the model even in the independent Libya and even in Gaddafi's Libya. So the sedentarization plans, the valorization plans of Italians were resurrected many times. So until the 1970s, the idea of having intensive farms along the coast of Libya was a powerful way to transform semi-nomadic tribes into sedentary communities. And also the exploitation of water resources started by the Italians through the introduction of electricity was even incremented during the Gaddafi era. So Gaddafi started to build the human-made river that was pretty much based on the same idea of extraction of water and irrigation of the coastal area of Libya. So the idea of the misunderstanding of the desert was introduced by European colonization and stayed there for a long time. So, and still nowadays, there's really not a positive evaluation of the desert. So I think the legacy of colonialism was really the misunderstanding of desert as a complex ecosystem, and it's still pretty much there. So there's not an alternative narrative to colonialism.
Yeah, thank you very much. I look again in the room or at home if there are any other question. Maybe
Yeah, I can send it, but there's even more in. I
In the
can send
book.
you also the PDF of the chapter of the book
Yeah.
that talks about the colonial enterprise fascism in Africa. Yes, I will.
maybe the time for the last question on the periodization, because you are already starting talking about it. You said something about the development of environment, okay, and how you connected it to history. So the history of fascism, the periodization of fascism, and the evolution of environment in the colonial enterprises. So
Yes, this is a problem of environmental scholarship in Italian fascism. So is it a valuable periodization also for ecological transformations or not? Yes and no. So it depends what we want to do. If you want to stress the connection between nature and politics, so it's good that we can look at the transformation of nature as another way to look at the formation of the regime. And then in that sense, the same like development of the economic policy or the demographic policy, every policies that the regime introduced was pretty much changed pretty much around the 1920s, 1934. And this is the same like rupture that we can look from an environmental perspective of fascism. So from a scientific perspective, I mean, 1928 was really a turning point in scientists that were from an independent science and an authoritarian science. Also the idea of integral transformation, where it was introduced at the beginning of the 30s. And even if you look at these different plans of Libyan colonization, or the 1928, 1934 is still another time a major periodization and a major turning point of the fascist regime. And also if we look at the creation of the empire, the 1935 is another turning point. So there are a lot of fractions within this time period of 1922, 1943 that we can look at. Also, autarky is another moment in which nature started to be conceptualized and exploited in a different way. So yeah, there are many fractures within the regime, and more in general, like the Italian environmental history found like two major moments in which the relation between Italy and nature changed. So the first one was the privatization at the end of the 19th century. And then the other moment is the economic boom in the afterwar period. So fascism, again, is not a periodization process if we want to look at the development of Italian environmental history. But still, it depends on the question that we pose to our research and also the elements that we want to analyze. Or it can be and it cannot be. It really depends on the questions.
thank you very much. I don't see any question. So I think we can thank Roberta Biasillo for this wonderful lecture. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I would like only to announce our next KNIR Research Dialogue, which will continue in May, so May the 10th, with as guest speaker, Professor Barbara Goff from University of Bari, who will talk on why post-colonial classics matter. And of course, those who don't have don't receive our newsletter, please subscribe to it, because you will be updated about our program. And now we thank again Roberta, and please join us for a drink here in the room. And thank you very much for those at home.
Thank you.